very pleased to have Pia as a presenter today. She also is a principal consultant at Waugh, surprise, surprise, and has done an amazing amount of work and is a substantive role model, particularly for women in ICT. If you notice stats, those numbers are declining if you look at the graduate intake and undergraduate intake at universities around the country. So Pia, I thought I'd emphasise my introduction of that critical role that we play in inspiring lots of people, but particularly women, to consider careers in IT. It's the way you say it, it's the way you do it. You give so much of yourself to what you're passionate about. It really makes a difference. And we don't need any comments from our husband. Take it in a direction I don't want it to go. But she's also an international leader working with free and open source technology and a key advocate for that regard. So Pia, I'll leave it there. Over to you. Please.
See, now I just feel embarrassed. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful introduction. What I want to talk to you guys about today was very specifically open source as a public resource for public good. Obviously, some of the outcomes of today is hopefully going to be communiques into the 2020 summit, and we've had a look through all the representatives, and there are some great people there. Terry Cutler, who's here today, so where is going to be there? Lisa Harvey, who's another friend of mine. There's a whole bunch of great people on there, but I think there's a massive underrepresentation of technology, and there's certainly an underrepresentation of open source thought leaders, and I just hope that perspective does get presented there. But in any case, our communique will hopefully introduce some of those ideas. So what I'm going to jump into is, first of all, I just want to make clear, we, as in the open source community, the open source industry, open source and research, all the people using it, doing stuff about it, we actually have a lot of work to do ourselves. We need to make sure that we're not just saying, here's all the stuff you need to do, government or companies or research, but making sure we take on the things that we need to do. We need to fix public misconceptions. Jeff and I are in the process, as he was saying, of releasing this report about the open source industry and community, and we actually asked the industry and community what they saw to be the biggest issues in uptake of open source, and the highest one for both was actually public education about open source. But there's a lot of public misconceptions are also getting in the way. We need to fix the ineffective and negative lobbying. The amount of people in government that say to me, we understand that there's opportunities in open source, we understand that there's good stuff there to do and stuff for us to do, but part of the problem we have is all the letters that we get from people saying, what's wrong with you, you're all fascists, and obviously you're conspiring against us. And that makes it harder for them to actually do their job and get open source in a positive and constructive way. So we need to make sure that our lobbying is positive and is in terms of engaging rather than smacking over the head. We need to make sure that we're engaging with government, we're engaging with research, and engaging with the broader general public rather than assuming the worst. We need to improve our promotion and marketing, improve the public discourse around open source. Software Freedom Day is an international outreach day that happens once a year that I'm heavily involved in. And in Australia, we have over sort of 20 or 30 events happening around Australia once a year, every year, to help get the word out to the general public. Those kinds of things are really positive public discourse to get why software freedom is important to the general public. And encouragement over public embarrassment. I actually am not sure what I was thinking when I wrote that, sorry. But anyway, getting better case studies and positive media out there, which means having good relationships with the media, with government, and with the broader community. So, just to start off, there's a few things that we have to do. Now, I want to jump into why do I think open source is good for public good, and there's a whole bunch of reasons. There's lots of business opportunities that open source can bring to Australia and to the Australian ICT sector and to the broader business sector. We can take great technologies and put them together in a new and innovative way. We can build on top of those technologies. We can stand on the shoulders of giants rather than reinventing everything from scratch. We can actually create better export opportunities for Australia, building on top of open source technologies. And there's a fantastic example of this, a company called Open Kernel Labs, who actually created software which is all open source software. They've commercialized it and they've actually become world leaders in embedded technologies for mobile phones within a very short period of time by building on top of open source software. Rather than having to build from scratch, build a name from scratch, they were able to engage with the industry and with global players very, very quickly through building on top of open source. There's a huge amount of business opportunities. I only have 15 minutes, don't I? So I'm going to very quickly go through that. But one of the big things to remember here is 80% of our trade deficit is ICT. 80%. So we have a lot of work to do to try and equalise that out by hopefully improving our exports. And services is one of the best opportunities for exports that we have. And open source, of course, is very services oriented. There's a lot of economic opportunities. I've just gone through a couple. Education opportunities, not only for lowering the cost of infrastructure and functionality available to various different education institutions from kindergarten through to tertiary, but also in terms of the learning opportunities. The One Laptop per Child is a great thing for primary schools. All of the different collaborative nature of open source that you can bring to the classroom and actually get kids working together, not just to be dumb consumers of information, but to be creators of information, to be collaborators in information with their peers in the classroom and hopefully around the world. Some great lessons we can take from open source there. There's opportunities for government, not only again in terms of infrastructure or use, but in terms of, again, collaboration between governments in Australia and between governments around the world. There's so much infrastructure that government agencies are recreating from scratch, and the same sort of issues that were being chatted about in the non-profit sector apply to government, where there's a huge reinventing of base infrastructure that doesn't need to happen. And they could be leveraging not only open source technologies, but the methodologies to be more efficient and to improve their use of ICT and also their development of ICT. Social opportunities, I'm a big fan in terms of looking at the social impact of open source software. By the way, I'm not going to be doing the funny speech like Jeff. So he gave you all the funniness this morning, and I will be focusing on other stuff. I have a deep concern about the widening digital divide that we see around the world, but not just around the world, even in Australia. You have documents and information being published in formats that you can't read unless you have a particular application. I went to a very large conference a couple of years ago by the Unlocking IP group that Roger's involved in, a few other people in the room are involved in. And it was fascinating because I gave a speech in the afternoon about freedom and information freedom and why it's important, not only in a fluffy social way, but also in terms of economically and for business and for prosperity. And but the talks in the morning were fascinating because one person actually got up and said, information is really important. We care about everyone getting access to education information. And if you just buy our product, they will all have access to this. And it was just like, access to information is not about profiteering or marketing or about creating a new business opportunity. It is about access to information and all of the ongoing social and economic benefits that brings to individuals, to communities, and to our country and to the world. So there's great social opportunities. And open source creates a mechanism not only for people to get access to technology and to knowledge, but also to share that and to when you give a kid a computer preloaded with proprietary software, you may have given them some tools, but if you give them free software and open source software, you're actually empowering their entire community because they'll be able to legally share that with their friends, develop on it themselves, and be able to build on top of that. So there's a whole bunch of opportunities for public good. Collaboration, empowerment, particularly in this widening digital divide, the innovation opportunities that we have by building on top of open source, by collaborating with the best around the world. Armidale University, I forget what the name of the university is called. New England, University of New England. The maths department there actually uses an open source project called R, just R, the capital R, and the reason that they use that, not only is it because it's open source software and they don't have to worry about having hefty license fees in terms of distributing to their users, in this turn students, but it's because they can get their students involved in a global community of the best statisticians in the world. They're actually learning from that, contributing to that, playing a part in that community, and through that participation actually being able to become the best statisticians that they can be. So it's not just the software, it's the collaborative methodologies that they're actually able to build on top of. And finally, world leadership. The new ways, I guess, that Australia needs to be a leader is in terms of ICT. And it's so good to finally have the government talking about ICT in terms of the opportunity and innovation and being world leaders rather than just as a cost or just broadband. And we at the moment have some really great opportunities to actually be leaders in the world, and open source gives us a lot of those opportunities. So what can we do? And what I'm going to do now is talk about some specific things that I think we can put into the communique to go into the 2020 summit that could be very useful. And these ideas are informed by my own personal experience and understanding of the topic, but also by a communique that was sent to the Federal Treasurer by Linux Australia, by work that Tridge and a few others have been doing about in terms of what needs to go and Bob in terms of education. And hopefully we'll be able to decide upon a few key things to send in this communique. So the first thing is an open source resource for public, business, education and government use. This need not be one big mega resource. It might be a resource centre for education. It might be also have an innovation centre. You end up having a few different opportunities, but if the key issue is education in the public sector, education in the general market, and people not actually knowing what this is, how to use it, then we actually really need to seriously up the access to information about open source, access to useful, trusted information that people can actually go to and get access as a portal through to everything else. Linux Australia is a fantastic place to get information about the community and in many cases access about open source, but it is very much for technical people, for geeks. There are a lot of non-geeks involved in that community, but still there is a barrier to entry to some degree. Education doesn't have really a lot of resources at this point. I actually worked for a year and a half in a education research project looking at open source in the higher education sector, and the amount of siloing was fascinating. Everyone was doing their own thing, everyone had their own policy, everyone had the completely different understanding of what was going in within their small department, let alone between universities. So we need to pull together those knowledge bases and create a place that people can actually pull their information and go to for information. And it was fascinating. Tridge was putting together a proposal about a education resource specifically for the school sector to sort of try and create for them a resource about open source. And one of the interesting things about that in terms of if you look at funding is if you mention the word Linux or open source in a public fashion these days, you'll automatically get a discount from various proprietary vendors. And so the thing will effectively fund itself. I'm looking forward to the day when the Australian government and Australian businesses and Australian education sector turn around and say, well, if Thailand can get $4 Windows, where's our discount? Anyway, but there are some serious opportunities there. And it doesn't need to be a huge investment. It could...
Actually, what you say, you finish up the Windows.
Sorry? It's true. I think that it's really fascinating. Vista has been the best possible thing for the open source community. Thank you, Microsoft. Okay, we need more open source in education. This research project, the industry and community census, one of the things that really heavily showed is that the industry wants to hire lots and lots of people now, in the very, very short future. But it doesn't trust formal education institutions to fulfill those skills at all. People tended to get most of their skills from being self-taught through projects themselves, through mailing lists. And even though education was valued to some degree, it wasn't nearly as highly valued as participation in the open source community and participation in open source companies. I think what needs to happen is there needs to be more engagement with the education sector to help them, but also the other way around, from the education sector to the open source community and industry, to help them have skills that are more ready for this blossoming industry and community in Australia. We need to see a more practical commitment from government, but also from the business sector in terms of open standards. What I mean by that is, a lot of people talk about open standards. Oh yes, we support ISO standards. But when it actually comes to how they publish, how they archive data, how they, the amount of times I've gone to a website and the video is only available in a real player format or in a Windows Media Player format or something like that has been really frustrating. So there needs to be more practical commitment of publishing, archiving, sharing of data in open standards that actually provide open access. Because we don't have open access to data, then again we've got this digital divide in Australia. More clear policy and procurement guidelines. Zemo did what certainly was at the time a leading document on open source for government. That came out in 2005, from memory, and that those kinds of things need to be improved upon. We need to have a better idea of best practices for business, for education, and make it easier for people to actually get this stuff. A lot of times people are very, very interested in open source, but they don't have a clear way to actually get it. So we need to have an understanding of clear policy and procurement guidelines for government, for business, for education. Finally, investment into open source R&D. Now, actually, I'll just read you the quote first. I've got this great quote from a research project done by the EU into the socioeconomic benefits of or impact, should I say, of open source. And they said, increasing the FLOSS, free libre open source software, share of software investment from 20 to 40% would lead to a 0.1 increase in annual EU GDP growth, excluding benefits within the ICT industry itself, which is over 10 billion euro annually. You actually get more for your dollar when you spend money in open source R&D, because you're not just spending money for a developer to sit down and do a year's worth of work. You're actually able to leverage the combined benefits of the entire community behind that project. This is assuming that they're actually working with an open source community. If you build your own software internally and then release it open source, there are some benefits you can glean from that, but it's not going to be nearly as great as the benefits of actually engaging with or creating a community from the start of your project. So actually encouraging the investment of open source R&D as opposed to just R&D, I think will actually have a net benefit for Australia. And we can certainly do some research around that as they've done in Europe and try and do some comparisons there. Okay, so we have the power in Australia to actually do all of this today. We're not building from scratch. We already have a fantastic world-leading community. We have somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people in the open source community in Australia, probably more. There's certainly a lot more users in that, but those are people that actually participate in the community, that have some level of skills, and it's one of the strongest communities in the world. I mean, I've been to countries all around the world and seen all kinds of different approaches from open source communities and industries, and Australia is one of the strongest in the world. We have Linux Australia, the peak supporting community organisation. We have Open Source Industry Australia, the peak industry supporting organisation, and nowhere in the world do you actually see those kinds of organisations that are in there working very closely together and actually doing good things for their communities and industries. So we have great capacity. We also already have good case studies, good use of open source in government, in business, in education. We're just not getting them out there enough. We need to be promoting these things. We need to be making it clear that there is already success, and people looking at open source aren't doing it for the first time. There's lots of other people out there doing it very successfully. Has anyone here met Munir from the New South Wales Judicial Commission? Sorry, Morali. No, yeah. I'm thinking of someone completely different. Morali, he is so fantastic because he sort of gets up and gives a talk about how they've used open source in the New South Wales Judicial Commission. And it's a great case study, but I'll sort of cut to the chase. And at the very end of his talk, after going through everything very calmly and you know, very even-handedly, very balanced sort of approach, he sort of says, so it's working for us. If you don't want to use it, that's kind of your problem. You know, this stuff really works, and it's you know, not really a problem to me if you don't make it work for you. But it sort of pushes the point that open source is such a great opportunity, and I think that a lot of people are taking notice of those things now. So we need to build foundations of open, to lend from today's title. We need to build better infrastructure for open source development, education, government and business opportunities, and better collaboration. We need to build better policy and public knowledge about open source so that they can take more advantage of this world. We need to maintain and encourage a world-class development and business capacity. Otherwise, we will fall behind. Already, Australia is being rapidly overtaken by other countries who have invested heavily in their open source communities and development and starting to take off in leaps and bounds. The Foundations of Open research project that I did, which Jeff has made me now have to talk about, which I actually wasn't going to cover too much. Basically, what we did was I did a research project with the Ozwatch project at Oxford, I'm actually going to release this on my blog tonight now because it's been so much waiting. I'm waiting for people from Oxford to do a couple of things. But what we did was we went through and had a look at, we went through and had a look at the different sort of things that contribute to openness, and the things that we thought contributed were, the things that we thought openness had an impact was applicability, interoperability, and sustainability, and trustworthiness of systems generally. We then went through and had a look at the 5 core things that Jeff outlined before: source, standards, knowledge, governance, and marketplace. We also didn't say that openness necessarily means better. In some cases, openness can have a, you have to understand the impact it has without judging necessarily whether it's good or bad to understand whether it's applicable to your particular use case. If there is a particular security need for you to have a particular element closed, then that is a completely legitimate business case, and that's completely legitimate way to go. The one thing we do say though, is that the more closed any aspect of a system is, the greater the extent to which responsibility for that aspect falls upon a single entity, which creates a single point of control and which can give certain competitive benefits, but also creates some potential risks. So long as those things are balanced, it sort of works out. For each one of these things, we've defined it, and then we've gone through and put some questions, and then said, depending on the yes or the no answer of these questions, you can start to get a tactile understanding of what it means for your particular project or software or technology usage or whatever. So for instance, I'll give you an easy instance. Does the project rely on any closed proprietary standards, no or yes? If yes, the proprietary standards can limit a project's potential and interoperability. There are, of course, some projects that use proprietary standards for interoperability. However, this question is about whether a project could not work without the proprietary standard depended upon. So you're looking at dependencies, you're looking at what makes it open or less open, and what the final impact of that is. So anyway, and the other thing that we did with this project, which is where it gets quite contentious, is at the very end, I've tried adding some metrics, and then you start having judging, and then it starts to all go a bit pear-shaped. But we found some interesting things. We did apply our metrics to a few different things, and we did find, what was the most interesting one? MySQL, I think. So a comparison of databases, Postgres, MySQL, and Oracle. You can see that generally Oracle is more closed, except for in the case of standards, where they actually are reasonably standardized. You can see that in terms of license, even though Postgres and MySQL have very different licenses, there are equal levels of openness because of the different benefits they bring. And what you do is go, by reading through, you can see what is the practical impact of these different levels. And I'm just going to keep going. But anyway, I'll release this tonight. And but the whole idea of this research project was to give a model to understand the impact of the different elements of openness on any sort of technology. So very quickly, that's all I had. I didn't know which email address to have, so I just used a personal one because I have too many email addresses these days. There's some really great references. Most people here will know most of these, but I thought I'd throw them in here just for reference sake. Any questions?
Roger Clark again. Can I carry on Tom's theme? He avoided naivety earlier on with another speaker. Great stuff in terms of positive go forward and doing more things and getting the word out there. The fact is there's nasty things out there. There's organisations that have got strong interests that they perceive to be threatened by all forms of openness. What it seems to me that there has to be from the movement as a whole, talking about it as a capital N movement incorporated, is a complementary strategy that deals with the nasties. The nasties seem to me to be in a couple of different clusters. One of them is clearly that there are some organisations that are going to need significant pressure on the organisations because of the ways they work.
Yep.
Since we're around to pick up Microsoft that are big enough to look after themselves, I've got a particular problem with it at the moment in relation to Prodentica. I don't know if people know about this So there's got to be pressure on the organisation. There's also got to be pressure to sustain those organisations that have shown solid signs, like one big one sitting up behind me here, one that we don't really understand that's sitting over in the other corner over there, that's rather big and certainly uses open, and you knew who I meant. So those
and contributes, not just users.
Yeah, so those things all need strategies built in within this same capital N movement. And since you're sitting on the top of this capital N movement,
No one sits on the top of the movement, let's be clear. Okay, so there's a couple of things there. First of all, there is absolutely no way it is impossible to apply any strategies to the open source movement, because it is a whole bunch of individuals doing their own thing. And I have been dealing, that is both a strength and a weakness of the community, and as such, the best thing that we can do, because we will never be able to say, don't talk about that, hey you, I know you're a ranter, please don't say anything, because they will rant more, as anyone who's tried to shut down someone, or seen someone, or been shut down, or whatever, will know. That's the first thing. But that's where the leadership of organisations like Linux Australia and Open Source Industry Australia becomes really, really important, because if they can provide those trusted sources of knowledge, then when someone writes to a minister and says, you're a insert expletive here because you don't use open source, then hopefully there will be enough knowledge, and this is where those organisations need to reach out and create those, engage with government, with education, with business, so that when those things happen, which sometimes they unfortunately do, then at least there is an idea of, well, we have an understanding of why that has to happen, and at least we can go back to our friends and say, is this for real or not? That's I think the lead that those organisations need to take. In terms of dealing with the sort of organisations that you're talking about, there's two things. First of all, by recognising when companies get it right, I think that's a really, really good model, because we can say, such and such company has done this, that's really fantastic, look how they've engaged with the community. I mean, a really good example of this is actually very early on how Sun actually engaged with the GNOME project. They had people in there doing great stuff without trying to sort of take over, with trying to deal with it in a, trying to support it without applying their I guess, corporate perspective down on the project. Yeah, there's a bunch of examples. But the other thing is, that's part of the reason that I started coming up with this idea of we started coming out with the idea with the Foundations of Open. Because we can have a model to say, here is an example of a technology that has an open market, that allows other companies to participate, that does it in the right sort of way, that allows participation through the governance model, that allows participation through creating a market around it. If we can, and this doesn't apply to companies, it applies to projects, but if we can use that kind of model to recognise openness when it does happen, then we have a better chance of doing something about it when it doesn't happen. At the moment we have, well, for a long time there anyway, we had this point where everyone, and it's still happening, is jumping on the open source bandwagon. Oh, look at this, it's open source, and they use a little O and a little S, and then you go and you find out actually it's not open source at all. And we don't have an easy model to recognise that, because if we take open source with the strict letter of the law, it's like, oh, it's got an open source license, so that's it. And when I realised a bunch of companies started doing that, that's when we started thinking about, well, we need a better way to understand openness broader than just the license. So I think that the open and transparency of the model itself is what's going to, excuse the phrase, but keep the bastards honest.
Ole.
Yeah, hi, my name is Ole Nielsen. I work for Geoscience Australia, which is part of the federal government. And I have some concerns in general about the way we shape the business case for open source, especially in the context of the openness of public service. And although I think you're very much on the right track, what happens is that the Australian public service is uniquely placed to really benefit from open source at all three tiers, really, and also in creating open source, because the public
think, again, Linux Australia and Open Source Industry Australia have to play a very, very strong role, because if they have the relationships and if they have the limelight in terms of they're actually actively getting that message out and being a responsible representation for the different perspectives around free and open source software, I think that can help. By the way, it was funny to hear that, because I think you're the only person with a ponytail in the room. No, except me. It's okay. And again, it comes back to this education. We're in the early phases where if a loud but incorrect person jumps up and down from any side of the fence about open source at the moment, it gets a lot more legs than it possibly necessarily should. I'll give you a slightly flipped example of this. There's a lot of people from India getting involved in some open source projects now, from the Indian development community. And there's sort of a cultural difference where, and this has happened quite a few times now, where someone will come in and they'll say, hi everyone, to the general mailing list, and say, I'm thinking about doing this, what does everyone think? And some random person who has nothing to do with the project will be like, oh, that sounds like a good idea, and then they'll go off and implement it, and then bring it back, and then the leaders of the project be like, well, why'd you do that? This understanding of who actually speaks for the community is a problem, and I think that the fact that open source is succeeding so well in spite of that is an attestant to the strength of and the opportunities open source actually provides, right? We really need the leadership from the people in the community and the leadership from the community representative organisations themselves.
Tony?
Tony Hill from the Internet Society of Australia. Just trying to get this issue down to something very specific. There's certainly been a lot of debate about terms of government contracts with people who develop software over the years, and I don't think that issue is yet settled yet. One thing I noticed float by the other day was an initiative by the Victorian government, I think, to pass intellectual property in a project to the developer. I guess my question is, do you think that sort of initiative is going to help or hinder the open environment, and what are we going to do about that?
So I think what the Victorian government has done is excellent, and it actually is taking from the lesson that we've seen in the UK, where and it's not so much a government thing as a research thing in the UK, every research project in the UK has to, as part of their research proposal to get the grant money, has to put in a little spiel about sustainability. How is their research going to have a benefit above and beyond the terms of the research project, the funding that goes into it and such? And as such, lots and lots and lots of software coming out of the research sector in the UK is now open source by default, because they're using that as a, that makes it sustainable. I think that applying that kind of approach, unless there is a specific security or commercialization or other business case, is a very good policy, and we should be looking at that, I think, as a federal policy. But the other thing we need to do, though, is, I think, two core things. First of all, create the mechanism for within government, and it's mainly within government, but there's certainly other sectors where this is appropriate, such as research, where people can actually share more effectively, so that rather than getting to the end of a project and then releasing it open source and then having it die on SourceForge, as many, many, many projects do, they can actually engage with each other, and possibly, where it may be appropriate, with an external technical community as well, the broader open source community, to actually make sure the project is sustainable right throughout, rather than throwing an open source license on it at the end of the project and hoping that that makes it more sustainable. And hopefully that will actually improve the collaboration between government technical people and reduce the reinvention that's happening so much at that level. So I think certainly there's a policy need there, but there's also a need to actually create the mechanisms for collaboration, and there's also a need to educate about engaging and creating a community around software, because it's not just a static thing, and it's not something that is sustainable just by having an open source license.
I'm Tim Murphy, I'm from the Office of Senator Carter on his Innovation Department. You mentioned Terry Cutler. I must urge you to consider the strategy of the innovation system is underway at the moment. Very okay. However, is also looking at the collaboration CRC model. I'm not going to tell you what to put in your solution, because it's not do that. But I would urge you to think about a consistent message. As much as you possibly can
Stephen Caroline from the big corporate end of town. So I found it quite fascinating seeing your presentation. I mean, you wonder why open source doesn't get more traction. And I'll give you a bit of my view. One is I'm a supporter of open source, but as open source can be put forward a little bit too radically. And I think you've got to remember when you stand there and say the bastards or that, you're actually going to have the opposite effect you want. So
That was a quote, by the way.
yeah, no. It's actually very, very important. So you've got to remember, people do view some components of open source community as radical. And I think what people need to understand is there is a balance between closed and open. And if you get that balance right, I actually think open is going to grow. But it's going to do itself a disservice if it doesn't know how to work with the closed source. I mean, Microsoft, love them, I hate them, I love Microsoft. They've invested an immense amount into our industry, and as a matter of fact, we're here, many of us probably because of the money
Absolutely.
Microsoft put in. So I think we've got to acknowledge some of that, we've got to dislike some things they do, we've got to work with big companies like that, and I think a more balanced view will actually help open source, and the radical view works against it.
Actually, I'm going to agree but disagree to some degree. First of all, it's got nothing to do with Microsoft. I absolutely credit where credit's due, and we wouldn't have a PC on most desks, well, a lot of desks, certainly in developed nations anyway, if it wasn't for a lot of the work that they did. And it's no, it's true. Okay, whatever. At any rate, there is, Microsoft has done some good work, and you only have to speak to anyone that works at Microsoft to know that they're very passionate about what they do, and at the end of the day, geeks are geeks, and if we can connect with them, then maybe we can lure them to freedom. But that's a whole different story. But there is an important thing to understand that they're also, the corporate end of town are getting involved in open source, not because because there's a business there. There is a legitimate and a very, very strong business opportunity, and the fact is the market are crying out for it. So there is certainly a level of the community needs to raise its standards in terms of how it interacts with the general population, with government, with education, with corporate, certainly. But there also should not be a compromise on the things that the community finds important. At the end of the day, most of the community are going to be developers or documenters or all kinds of other people who are just going to do their thing and aren't actually going to be part of that engagement. So it's the people in leadership positions in things like Linux Australia and Open Source Industry Australia who are going to make that connection, and it's their responsibility. It's not the broader community's responsibility. I certainly wouldn't want to go to a random kernel or GIMP or whatever hacker and say, it's your responsibility to go out and talk to government, because it's not. And there can't be a compromise of specific things that are important to the very foundations of openness that have provided this opportunity for open source. Open source is an output of an idea, and there are going to be many more outputs, such as open standards, such as open knowledge, such as Wikipedia. They're all outputs of the fundamental idea that human beings are better off when we share and when we actually collaborate in an open fashion. So,
and let me be honest, I think if client can go ask 99% of the rental, I'm absolutely agree with that statement. But then it's understanding there's just two parts of this.
Oh,
So
yeah.
we want to encourage companies to go spend 10 billion or 5 billion or depends on the organisation, 5 million into 50,000 in investing in R&D. And some of that model is going to require flows. So, from my point of view, and from my organisation point of view, we support a lot of things open. We think there's a lot of really good things, and we believe a lot of open access to data. But we also believe there's areas that absolutely doesn't apply. And it's right. One of the examples you gave earlier, I thought was perfect when someone said, "Why doesn't the open source community have the strategy?" And you said, "Well, they can't." And that's exactly where closed the market is. There are some things that can go really well in the open environment and the collaboration environment. There are also some competitive advantages of one organisations which are going to be the exact opposite of that. And
This is why Red Hat rocks. This is exactly why Red Hat rocks.
I agree.
Open source architecture, and they've tailored it specifically for that use case.
I agree, but for those who've used Red Hat, as an organisation provided services, they have huge downfalls as well in terms of what they do.
as does every
Okay.
commercial
Rusty.
company.
Rusty, you wanted to say something, and then lunch is ready.
Yay.
Wow, that's pressure. that default's really important. It's partially important because it's often, the whole point is that you can't tell what use it would be.
Yeah.
It becomes useful for other people. The case that struck me recently was if you look at Wikipedia's image of the day, they pick a nice picture of the day, and they have a huge number of those come from the US, particularly the US military, because of their default stance that their works that are owned by the government will fall into public domain and not be copyrighted. And so, just that minor fact has meant that there's actually a huge slant towards US pictures on Wikipedia. As a completely random side effect of this policy. And that's the kind of case where you could imagine if Australia had a more aggressive policy, that, unless there was a good reason that the court case would be that it would fall into the public domain, there would be a lot more pictures of Australia on Wikipedia. Just as a side effect, which has all kinds of flow-on effects, you can imagine, in a sort of a cultural awareness issue. It would probably be difficult to measure what the impact of that would be, but it's exactly the kind of thing that occurs. Although you can't look at a particular case and go, yes, we should allow this one in because I think that will have a huge cultural impact. It won't. But in the large, it can make a big difference.
And I think that what you're saying about you don't know how it's going to be applied. You see all kinds of technologies that someone takes it and uses it in a way that you've never imagined, and that's innovation, and that's what open source provides as opportunity. So I think that, yeah, absolutely.